welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy, where we discuss policy issues of relevance. My name is Priyal D'almeida, and I am a research analyst working at the Takshashila Institution. Now, before we begin, I would like to give a shout out to the courses that we have. As you know, Takshashila is an independent, non-partisan think tank and a school of public policy. And we have education programs that last between one semester to 1 year. And these are specifically tailor-made for you guys. They are all online and you can take them from anywhere. And admissions are now open for our 12-week graduate certificate program in public policy, defense and foreign affairs, and technology and policy. Application deadline for this September 2022 cohort is 27th August. And if you need any further information about these programs, you can log on to school.takshashila.org.in and everything will be available there. Now, let's get on with the topic that we have today and to discuss the current. So, what we're going to talk about is a battery swapping policy that was put out recently by NITI Aayog. And recently, the Honorable Finance Minister, in her budget speech of 2022-2023, announced that the Union government will introduce a battery swapping policy. And so we thought we will have a small podcast episode on this. And to discuss this with us, we have Rohan Pai, who is my colleague at Takshashila and an assistant program manager here. Hi, Rohan. How are you doing?
Hi, Priya.
Hi.
I'm good.
Okay. So let's get on directly to the topic, right? Can we start by understanding what exactly is battery swapping?
Yeah, sure. So today around the world, there's a rising environmental consciousness. And
Right.
with countries around the world trying to move away from internal combustion engine vehicles that produce high CO2 emissions, electric vehicles are now in the limelight.
Yeah.
So when it comes to electric vehicles, there are optimists and skeptics, but they are broadly being seen across the world as an alternative to vehicles that are dependent on fuel.
Right.
So electric vehicles are traditionally purchased with fixed batteries, which means you can only charge them using the power supply setup at home or at a charging facility if that's available nearby.
Okay.
And usually charging your vehicle from 0 to 100 means not being able to use your vehicle for a period of 45 minutes or an hour because it is plugged into the power source. And 45 minutes to an hour is for vehicles which are much more advanced than maybe the 2 and 3 wheelers that we have in India. But
Right.
let's consider that as a minimum. So now the major problem that is hampering the mass adoption of electric vehicles is at this point in time, consumers do not see electric vehicles as a reliable alternative to mainstream fuel-powered vehicles.
Right.
And this is where something like battery swapping comes into the picture.
Okay.
So introducing battery swapping would allow EVs to, one, become highly accessible products in the market due to lower acquisition costs because it is based on decoupling the vehicle from its battery. Second, there will be a wide availability of time-efficient recharging options as this system would allow consumers to drive straight into a battery swapping station and switch a used low-on-power battery with a charged one. So this means that the time taken to recharge your vehicle is reduced drastically. So imagine something like this. Your normal fuel-powered vehicle which you have today, when it's low on fuel, you go straight into a petrol bunk, you fill it up, it takes around 5 minutes. And having a battery swapping station would mean the downtime is the same. You don't have to charge your electric vehicle for 45 to 50 minutes. You can just walk into a battery swapping station and take out the used battery and switch it with the new one right then and there. And that's just a 5-minute process. So that's what battery swapping does. And lastly, one point I'd like to add is that if we bring in a battery swapping ecosystem in India, then it just increases the confidence of consumers who are looking to invest in electric vehicles because there's a reliable infrastructure that goes along with electric vehicles that are available. So that's basically briefly, that's what battery swapping is.
Okay. Yeah, that thanks for that, Rohan. And also, like, what I know on the very surface is that NITI Aayog recently put up the battery swapping policy document, right? It's at the draft stage. So could you tell us what are some of the highlights of this policy that they have proposed?
Yeah, sure. So NITI Aayog put out this draft battery swapping policy in April this year. And I would say it's India's first major step towards achieving net zero emissions by 2070 by simply making way for the decarbonization of high greenhouse gas intensive sectors such as transport and energy. So the battery swapping policy is being introduced to encourage the mass adoption of EVs, but the ecosystem is mainly being set up for two and three wheelers at this point in time. As stated in the policy itself, two wheelers account for 70 to 80% of all private vehicles in India. And
Right.
three wheelers like your auto rickshaws and all that, they play a critical role in public transit, freight transport, and last mile connectivity in cities. So this segment of two wheeler and three wheelers, that's being targeted first. So it's important to address here the fact that two and three wheelers may account for 80% of the vehicle stock in India, but they account for only about 18% of transport emissions in the country, which is why I'd like to emphasize here that this is a major step in convincing consumers that EVs are a reliable alternative, but it's still a very small start towards reaching our net zero emissions target. But apart from this, one of the major clauses in the policy that NITI Aayog put out is their aspiration to introduce technical standards on batteries that would
Huh?
enable the interoperability of components within the battery swapping ecosystem. So I won't go into the details of what the suggested technical standards are because that's not really important to our conversation right now. But what this basically means is having a standard battery pack which can be fit into a vehicle belonging to any brand or company so that we can still have multiple automobile manufacturers within the market that consumers can choose from. So, a trade off, obviously, with introducing standards is always the negative impact it has on innovation. Like, if the government is enforcing that the batteries are compatible with certain standards, there is reduced incentive for all vehicle manufacturers to work on their battery technologies.
Right.
Also, there is this added friction where all the players entering the market now have to get approval from the government, which just increases the bureaucratic processes involved. So, overall, I would say there is less clarity on how interoperability can be introduced without interfering with barriers of entry and market led innovation.
Right.
But apart from this, another highlight I would say is the mandate for battery producers to assign a unique identification number at the manufacturing stage for tracking and monitoring these batteries, because this would significantly alleviate concerns arising from multiple incidents of flames in electric two wheelers that we have come across in the last few months. The heat tolerance of lithium ion batteries is still being researched,
Mm-hmm.
and the technology to prevent such incidents is surely going to surface in the near future. But having a unique identification number is, I think, an important first step to addressing consumers' concerns here.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I have further questions about this, but before we go to those, let's take a short break and we will be right back. Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. And before we went on a break, we were discussing about the draft battery swapping policy that was proposed recently. Rohan, you mentioned about what were the highlights of the policy document that was put out and
Yeah.
what exactly battery swapping is and all. You've given us the basics of what was put out, right? Now,
Yeah.
going deeper into this entire thing, has battery swapping seen a presence outside India, or is this something that is first time put out in the world by India itself? And if there have been cases of battery swapping policies outside India, what have been the results of those?
Right. So I actually came across this report on ORF by Lydia Powell, Akhilesh Sati, and Vinod Kumar Tomar.
Mm-hmm.
And here's some fun facts they mentioned about battery swapping, right? So Mercedes-Benz, which is one of the most popular luxury car makers, actually tried battery swapping in the 1970s. So yeah,
Wow. Okay.
many, many decades ago. But unfortunately, they did not succeed. I don't know what the reasons behind the failure was, but that didn't take off then. Then much later in 2007, an Israeli company called Better Place reintroduced it, but they went bankrupt.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
so then there's this, you all know this very low key American company called Tesla, which you all might have
Right.
heard of.
Very low key.
Yeah. So in 2013, even they tried to experiment with battery swapping, but they were not too successful. And they went back to their own cable based charging system and a business model that integrated cars and charging. So, what we can gauge from this is that for a long time, battery swapping has been recognized as a solution to make electric vehicles a prominent alternative, but not many have actually succeeded in implementing it for various reasons. But within the last decade, China has made some major strides in this space. So, Chinese EV makers tried battery swapping early in the 2010s, but it did not really take off. And some of the reasons for this were the high cost of batteries and there's the lack of standards, lack of openness, and divergent technical and economic interests amongst key stakeholders. So at that point in time, because EVs didn't have as much strategic importance in the geopolitical context either, there was not much support from the government. But today, when they realize that, there have been many people who keep saying that, lithium is the next big thing and it's the new oil and all that. So when there is so much strategic importance being placed on it, the Chinese government has again taken an interest in this. And in 2020, they included battery swapping technology in their National New Energy Vehicle Development Strategy 2021 to 2035. So that's a 15-year plan. And it included battery swapping in the list of new infrastructure construction campaign. So they're trying to bring in battery swapping networks across the country to ensure that a mass EV adoption is a success. And actually, the results have just been unbelievable. So, China's EV startup called NIO has one of the most extensive networks as of March 2022, with more than 800 battery swapping stations offering customers a chargeable, swappable, and upgradable power plan. So, these are mostly working on consumers having subscription plans with batteries. And there are reports which state that around 90,000 private passenger cars and around 25,000 taxis are completely swap enabled in China. And at the moment, China's companies such as Geely Solar Technology and State Power Investment Corp are testing battery swaps for trucks.
Oh,
So
wow. Okay.
yeah. So while India is still trying to figure it out for two and three wheelers, China is already at trucks. That's because they invested in this technology years, like a decade before we did.
Yeah.
And obviously the results are showing that. So I would say that it's okay. Like it's not a race or anything, but China's success is also a great sign because it means that battery swapping is a viable option. And that can also turn out to be a major step forward in the Indian EV market.
Right.
I would also go one step further and say China's early failures are a good lesson for us on why building a robust EV ecosystem through battery swapping networks would require the successful implementation of interoperability standards, which are already proposed in the policy.
That's great, right? Because I think, given that there is at least one country that has been quite successful in implementing this, we can definitely take some lessons and we can sort of see how it can be sort of implemented in our country as well.
Exactly.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah. So, moving ahead, what lies ahead when it comes to battery swapping in India? And is there like anything that needs immediate attention to ensure that this battery swapping is successfully implemented in India?
Yeah. So to elaborate on what I just mentioned, in China, they haven't been able to impose interoperability. So there isn't a uniform standard for the battery models and packs of different car brands, and automakers have different battery technologies and standards that are not unified at present.
Right.
So at the outset, this is a major limitation on the practical application of battery swapping. Because for battery swapping to be effective, consumers cannot be constrained to only a few battery swapping stations. They must be able to, just walk in anywhere to any station and pick out a battery that is suitable for their vehicle. I feel like there is less clarity, or I would say rather a simplification in India's policy on this aspect, because it is not going to be easy to convince manufacturers to converge on certain technical standards, right?
Right.
This proves to be a major challenge because manufacturers would prefer to hold their battery pack designs as intellectual property, and they've generally signaled a disinclination towards cooperation on this front. But still, like a positive sign for India again has been the interest in the Indian market from Japanese automobile manufacturers, Terra Motors and Honda, both of whom have struck partnerships with local manufacturers even after a clear indication from the government that there'll be no backing down on the interoperability clause. So again, here I feel like to close the deal, the onus would be on the Indian government to build on this interest from the Japanese manufacturers and just pitch to them the sheer size of the market that they would potentially be operating in as one of the major incentives for them to invest in India. And I would also like to generally add that unless there is a clear indication or plan on how all the stakeholders will be placed in the battery swapping ecosystem, this involves, like charting out the business models and networks that battery manufacturers, automobile manufacturers, government and consumers will be operating in. If these are not laid out upfront, then it slows down the process.
Definitely.
Ideally, what we want is less government intervention on all fronts, apart from obviously the interoperability clause. But after that, there should be freedom for battery and automobile manufacturers to strike partnerships with each other while ensuring that they contribute to full capacity operations in, battery charging and battery swapping stations. So there's still, I feel like there's a lot of less information in the policy document on how they would want to see the ecosystem to grow. But I guess it's a wait and watch game, so we'll just have to wait it out.
Yeah. And also, I think we need to start somewhere, right? So this could be like a good starting point. And
Yeah,
with
definitely.
time, you definitely add more things as you understand what needs to be done more and how to get more people interested in this, and definitely, like you said, getting proper stakeholders and mapping them and everything is extremely important. And I think that's one of the
Exactly, yeah.
fundamental thing about any policy document and in any field. Yeah. So thanks, Rohan. Thank you for joining me in this episode and giving us an overview of what this policy is and all the nitty-gritties of it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, I hope our listeners also had a lot of fun listening to this. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.